It seems totally normal to listen to a podcast about the Toronto Argonauts. It's the X's and Argos podcast.
Welcome to the X's and Argos podcast, brought to you by Funny Bone Broth. My name is Ben Grant, joined as always by JB, and this is our last podcast before our game week podcast. JB, it feels like we've been waiting an eternity. We made it.
Yes, thank God. I really am tired of trying to come up with conversation pieces that don't involve actual football, so I'm ready to get into it.
Our lineup today, we're going to talk about Nick Arbuckle's health, something that has been on the radar for a lot of fans, and I've been getting a lot of questions about it, so we will address that. The second thing we'll talk about is the second double blue game, which took place yesterday, and then we will both make our roster predictions. There were some cuts made today. We'll go through those, and there still are a number of cuts to come, so that will all be covered in our third segment of today's show. So let's get to it. In terms of Nick Arbuckle's health, Nick Arbuckle sat out the double blue game yesterday, and this is the second time he sat out a double blue game. They've only had two, and he's missed both. He has been nursing a hamstring injury, I guess it's for about a week now, and I know a lot of people are concerned. So Coach was asked about that yesterday. He didn't seem that worried about it. He basically said he's being overly cautious, and I can vouch for that too. Like, I've seen some of the guys just watching practice, guys that he's sat out of drills, guys that seem to be moving to my eye perfectly well. But what he's basically said is anyone that's got any sort of nick or bruise, strain, whatever it is, someone's not feeling 100%. They sit because he doesn't want to go into the season down bodies. And with Arbuckle, it's a hamstring, which you do worry about. As you talked about last week, JB, it's just one of those injuries that can get worse in a hurry. And it's one that, frankly, we may be dealing with this all year. But Coach Dinwiddie said he doesn't want this to turn into something bigger, into a pull or a tear. And he expects Nick Arbuckle to be ready for Calgary. And I know, having spoken to Nick Arbuckle about it, I don't think there's anything that's going to keep him from playing in that Calgary game. He can't wait to play against his former team. And it may be a question on the other side, because I know Bo Levi Mitchell has been banged up. He's been dealing with a groin injury. So it's possible he may be a game-time decision. We'll have to see how that works out. I bet they wish they had a Nick Arbuckle in Calgary right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's highly unusual for a quarterback to play without reps. And I mean, we'll see what prep week looks like. Hamstrings are not good. They're reoccurring, and oftentimes you need to shut down. In all honesty, a lot of times I get frustrated when teams don't just simply shut somebody down and just accept, look, this hamstring is going to be a month, and there's no point pretending it's not and trying to get away with it and then tweaking it and then be out for a month. In my opinion, they should shut him down for a month and let him come all the way back. And I know that sucks, but that's just how it is. That's what the injury is. I believe they're kidding themselves if they think that they can manage a hamstring injury, because it's just not the kind of injury you can manage.
Yeah, I feel that, but I really thought, I was actually expecting and very nervous about them playing him this week, because just watching him move around, he looks fine when you watch him move around. And, every so often he'll maybe pull up a little bit, but if you weren't looking for it and you didn't know he was hurt, I think it may not stand out to you other than when he's not practicing. But he's actually looks like he's moving quite well. Now, maybe there was a setback in there that I didn't see. I haven't been every day. And so, that could be something that we're missing. But I actually thought he was okay. And I wrote in a piece this week on xsndargos.com when I was ranking the different positional groups, I wrote that one of the goals for this coming week should be just to sit Arbuckle all week. And I really believed they wouldn't. I thought they were going to have him out there because I thought they were going to prioritize the reps over everything else, because I think a lot of coaches would have. And I was really pleased to see Coach Dinwiddie basically sit him for this week and just take mental reps. And I know that's probably not as much time as you would like, and I agree with that. With the hamstring, we're talking about, you're talking about multiple weeks. You're not talking about just, sit for a few days and your hamstring will be fine. But He's not a player that has typically had to rely too much on his legs. It's a shame though, because he looks so much faster this year, and he's got this sort of explosion that he didn't have in Calgary. And I think maybe that's what led to this. I don't know, just him taking off and being so excited in his newfound mobility. But yeah, he's going to sit, but I expect him to start against Calgary. I've got my fingers crossed, and maybe this is going to be an ongoing thing all year where we've got our fingers crossed constantly. So long story short, the injury is a concern, but we should expect to see him on the field week 1.
It does sound like a wager topic.
We may have to. I think we'll need a segment in next week's podcast, because you've proposed a number of wagers that I feel pretty strongly about winning. So okay. I think we definitely have to make some bets next week leading up to the start of the season, because there's a number of bets that you've clearly misjudged things on. So I can't wait to get to that. Let's move on to the double blue game. And this is sort of the other half of the Arbuckle situation, and why Coach Dinwiddie has been preaching this entire offseason about the importance of having 2 starting quarterbacks. If something happens with Nick Arbuckle's hamstring, something more happens with Nick Arbuckle's hamstring, it's going to be McLeod Bethel-Thompson. And what's great about Arbuckle missing these reps is that these first unit reps have all gone to McLeod. And he looked fantastic yesterday in the double blue game. He opened up going 9 for 10. This is all against the first string defense as well. They were out there. He opens up 9 for 10, finishes the drive with a 33-yard touchdown pass to Levi Noel, who has suddenly turned into Jerry Rice. And, you couldn't have asked for more, because in the last double blue game, there was all this miscommunication. The offense couldn't get going. And that's been a theme of training camp so far. The offense has had trouble moving the ball. The defense has been outstanding. So what an amazing statement for the offense to come out yesterday and to just shove it down the defense's throat, which is probably the best thing that could have happened for their confidence level. But yeah, they may be looking to McLeod Bethel-Thompson if something happens, and I'm not actually worried about that. I feel very good about that situation. If he's needed, I think he looks great. I think he's ready to go. Other notable things from the game: Antonio Pipkin also played an outstanding game, and he's been able to show off his legs a little bit. He's been moving around. He's a pretty mobile guy, and Coach Dinwiddie installed this week a bunch of things like quarterback draws and bootlegs and just things to change the launch point, which helps a quarterback like him tremendously. He threw a touchdown pass to Damian Jean-Pierre. It was a 45-yard bomb. And he also had another touchdown pass to Levi Noel. He got in there on the Levi Noel love, and so he had those 2 TDs on his score sheet. So that's pretty cool.
Why do you think Noel has exploded in camp? It's so unusual for a known player and a player who's 30 to suddenly, be so much better than we had seen him be.
Yeah, it's such a weird thing, because having watched Levi Noel for a couple of years, it wasn't something that was at all on my radar. I didn't think at the beginning of camp, well, here's a guy that's going to explode. For me, he was borderline to make the team this year. When we looked at the receiver group that we had going into camp, I can't remember off the top of my head now, but I don't think I had him making the squad in my initial projections. And he has looked like the best player on the field for the offense throughout the entire camp. He's been amazing. And I don't think it's anything different with him physically. He physically looks the same. He doesn't look bigger. He doesn't look faster. His route running, maybe that's improved a little bit, but I think a lot of it is system. He's been playing in a spot that allows him, I think, to take advantage of routes that he runs particularly well. He has a great post route. He runs seams very well. He runs digs and drags really well. And lining up in a slot position for Coach Dinwiddie, especially when he's to the field side, and there's so much space out there, he's taken advantage of DBs on a couple of those instances. So that could be it. That could be what's led to his success, is just a system thing where this works for him. Because I know he'd been previously he'd played a lot on the outside, and now having him in the slot, maybe that's all it took, is just these different combinations. Because we know that different players play better and worse in different systems. Not every system works for every player. So I know it's not a concrete answer. I don't think I brought you a lot of science in that, but I think that's got to be what it is, because it's him. Those are the things that I really haven't seen him do before. And it just so happens that those are things he excels at. Other camp notes to pass along, things that we noticed. There was another little bit of a skirmish, which again, I thought was great. There hasn't been much in training camp. There just haven't been that many conflicts, that many confrontations. That just really hasn't been a thing. There's been a lot of camaraderie, but I love to see the energy from stuff like this when guys sort of mix it up a little bit. And there was an incident in practice, nothing big, but there ended up being just a little bit of pushing and shoving. McRae getting into it a little bit with Edwards. They were just in each other's face, and Enoch Mwamba was the first guy on the scene to break it up. I love stuff like that. JB, as a coach, like, how do you feel about offense and defense kind of getting in each other's face?
I liked it if I felt like my offense was getting pushed around. So I like to see the offense try and have more of an aggressive mentality, more a defense style mentality. So I liked it. You know, I thought if the offense, I thought the defense fed off that. It made the defense better, and it made the defense respect the offense more. I think it's only good for the team if that level of intensity is there from the offense, which is not always the case.
JB, that's spoken like a true defensive coach. If the offense is just getting absolutely hammered, well, then it's okay for them to show just a little bit of emotion when they're on the floor. Then they can speak. Then they get their time. Some other plays that were made in the scrimmage yesterday. Curly Gittens Jr. continued his outstanding camp. These guys are making it so tough. And when we get to our roster projections later, they really did impact. Those two guys alone, they weren't guys that like I said, I was even thinking about, and they've completely thrown my depth chart on its head. And so he made another few outstanding plays, but the big highlight was a 55-yard reception. McLeod Bethel Thompson in his own end zone launches one down the sideline, and it just dropped in beautifully. You can see a highlight of that on the Argonauts website. This ball just dropping perfectly into Gittens Jr.'s hands. He's being covered by McFadden, and there was just nothing McFadden could do on that. It was just one of those perfect. JB, I don't know if you remember that Eli Manning pass to Mario Manningham years ago, but it was just one of those that just dropped in right at the sideline, and it was almost like Curly Gittens Jr. Like there was nothing he could do but catch the pass right in front of the bench. It was just amazing. So that was another highlight on there. And other than that, great to see DJ Foster on the field, Terry Poole out there playing some left tackle. Those are great things. And the nice thing about being able to rest some of the veterans that weren't playing in the game, some guys that were getting a little bit of rest, or some guys that were nursing injuries, was that it gave some of these younger guys a chance to shine. And Coach said yesterday that he felt that's exactly what they did, that the offense looked great, which he was hoping for. The defense rebounded and tightened up in the second half of their double blue scrimmage, but the offense looked good, and the young guys made plays. And that's what you want to see in training camp, especially when your veterans are resting. Moving on to our last segment, JB, you and I both put together final rosters and depth charts and sort of broke down how we thought this process would go. I've done this before, and I know how difficult it is. How did you find putting together a roster given the ratio elements that you've got to keep track of?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, surprisingly, not that bad. There were probably 3 or 4 names that I kind of put on and take off and put on and take off in terms of the final roster. But I found most guys really selected themselves. That the Canadians that we have a strong Canadian collection of players on the team. So it was really easy actually to pick the Canadians. It wasn't like, how am I going to find 21 good Canadians? I thought that, there are probably 4 big question marks I have, but other than that, I feel pretty confident that I have that I've taken a pretty good guess at the best roster.
I had a much more difficult time than you, and like you said, though, it wasn't so much about the quality of the Canadians. It was more the opposite problem. I thought there's so many good Canadian linemen, especially, that I really wrestled with what to do on the line, because I found, and maybe we'll get into this a bit later when we get into the specific positional groups, but The problem I really ran into is that I really wanted to have either Isaiah Cage or Dejan Allen. And I didn't know how to build that roster and keep one of those two guys to back up my starting left tackle in Terry Poole. And that was where the Canadians suddenly I had difficulty with, because I needed so many Canadian linemen because they're too good not to have. And then I just found, well, but I don't want to dress 8 or 9 offensive linemen. And so that was the only area that I ran into issues was that there's just so much Canadian talent. There's certain guys that you just couldn't leave off the roster. So that's what made it so tough for me. So to remind anyone listening, if you want to take a look, and this is maybe where we can have a little bit of visual support for you. If you want to go to xsandargos.com, you can pull up my most recent depth chart, and you can kind of look through it as we go through each positional group and see maybe more clearly what it is we're talking about. But as a reminder for those that don't know, this is how roster construction works. So this year is a little different. They've tweaked it again. So you've got 2 quarterbacks, and that's of any designation. Nationality doesn't factor in there. Then you've got 21 or more nationals, so 21 Canadians. You can have more, but it's very unusual too. And then a maximum of 20 Americans. So for the purposes of this drill, we just went with absolutely clear numbers. 2 quarterbacks, 21 Canadians, 20 Americans, 1 global player, and then you can have 1 reserve player, which comes into play on game day. Typically, that's with a backup kicker or something like that. Argos fans saw that happen back in 2019 when Krapina ended up getting hurt in pregame warmup. We were okay because we had our other specialists listed as the reserve. And that's what a lot of teams do. That's how you can use that so you don't end up playing the entire game without a kicker and punter, because obviously that's a disaster. All right, JB, let's go through. We'll start with the easiest position first. How many quarterbacks did you keep?
Yeah, 2. I think that they would love to keep 3, but the talent level is too deep on this team to carry 3.
Yeah, they would. Like, everyone would like to. I know Coach Dinwiddie loves Antonio Pipkin. He really feels good about all 3 guys, but he's almost said as much as he's just going to have 2 guys dressed on game day because it just, like you said, it takes away all the flexibility that you have at all these other positions if you have 3. And it's just so rare that all 3 are needed for a specific game. So now maybe it's a situation where the reserve guy is a quarterback. That could be something that comes into play instead of a kicker, as some teams have. But I think it's going to be just Arbuckle and McLeod Bethel-Thompson. If one of those guys gets injured, then Pipkin slides in the next week. But I don't expect them to dress anything other than 2 QBs all year. That was by far the easiest decision for me. Running back is a little bit more difficult because you see this range so much across the league. I have 2 running backs on my roster. I'm not counting fullbacks here, just running backs. What did you go with, JB?
Yes, I also just have 2 running backs. I think that Foster hopefully is going to be in the mix moving forward, but not yet.
Yeah, and that's the same thing I feel too. So John White, AJ Ouellette, those are the 2 running backs. And if Foster pans out, and I expect him to, I'd be very surprised if Foster hasn't worked his way into this lineup in some way or other by, let's say, week 3, because I do think he is a real talent. But he's only just arrived. It's great to see him out there yesterday for the double blue game, but he just hasn't had enough time yet. So I think having him on the roster to start the season is premature. So I think he'll start on the practice squad, but I think he'll be knocking on that door pretty quickly.
Well, it certainly all depends on how week 1 goes.
Yeah, that's true. But another one of the heroes from yesterday's game was AJ Ouellette. And those guys have done everything they can to make sure they're not overtaken by anybody. Because there were some other good performances in camp. Greg McCrae looked really good, I thought. You've got Kenneth Dixon, who didn't necessarily look as good as I expected him to. But there were people breathing down their necks. And both AJ Ouellette and John White did everything that was asked of them. And Ouellette had a huge game yesterday. Coach Dinwiddie said in his press conference post-scrimmage that he felt both of those guys were deserving of starting roles. So I can't see it any other way than that. 2 running backs, both Americans. So now we get into a positional group where we finally see some Canadians. Fullback. So I ended up with 3 fullbacks on my roster. I'm guessing you're a little lower.
Yeah, this is one I went back and forth a lot on. I think initially I had 1 fullback. I thought that the backfield was a position that they might steal from, because in many ways maybe the players they want are not on the roster yet. But I ended up going with two fullbacks.
And I assume that's Cross and Pellerin?
It is. Yeah. I initially, to be honest, I had Cross off and I had another Canadian in that defensive line. But I think 3 is probably really too thin to break camp with. So four is the number that I think I feel comfortable with.
So 4 total backs. And Cross, see, that is an interesting one. And I would have respected, but blasted you for not having Cross on the team. I think the idea of Pellerin being his replacement, I think, is an eventuality. You know, that's happening down the road. I think it is written. He's basically a clone of Declan Cross. And you just say they even look the same. They've even got the exact same hair. So that's something that I think is inevitable. And Cross is doing everything he can, like so many players on this team, to be a great mentor and really teach him how it's done, show him the ropes. But I just don't think I don't think there's any way he can be quite there yet. So I think we've got another year of Cross. Pellerin's going to learn the ropes, and maybe this is his show next year. But Cross is sort of the elder statesman in the CFL right now in terms of that fullback spot. So I had 3 fullbacks. I also have Asnel Robo in there. That's how I am dealing with my global player spot, and I think he's earned that spot. Asnel Robo, I don't expect him to touch the football. I don't think that's going to be his role. I think he's such a value on special teams. He's such a bull. I think he's 5'7" and he's like 220, and it's just so hard to stop his momentum, and it's so hard to get through him. I love him as an up back. I love him on the outside in field goal. There's so many places you can use him. He's just a special teams machine, and so I think it's just such a great use of that global player representation. So if you didn't go with Robo, I'm interested to hear how that works out a little bit later in the roster. But yeah, for me, that was the best answer at in that global player spot. So I've got 3 fullbacks. That's our first difference. All right, let's move on to the receivers. How many receivers are you dressing on your Argos squad?
Yeah, well, I'm going with 8. I think that it was a really, I mean, what was amazing is I think like 6 of them are locks, which is I think a real nod to how much talent is on there. And then I think we might disagree on the final 2.
Yeah, well, I only have 7, and it's funny because when you say you have 8, I'm immediately jealous because it was something that I hummed and hawed over. There's too many guys I want to keep, but like you said, you just don't have that many options. And so I didn't keep guys like Daniel Braverman. I would love to have kept, and I didn't. And I think I wouldn't be surprised to see that I'm wrong there. I also don't have Sinkfield, and I expect to kind of be wrong there as well. And I've noticed just kind of going down this too, I may have made a mess of this positional group because I don't have Worthy either. And I think I've kind of like painted myself into a corner here where I don't know who's returning the football for me anymore. I guess Dejan Brissett better step up and return it. But the guys that were like returning punts, for example, I've cut them all. So I don't know what I'm going to do here. Go through your 8. Who do you have that I don't have? I guess it's probably Sinkfield, but let's see if the rest are the same.
Yeah. I mean, my 6 locks, right? I mean, Rogers, Brescas, Daniels, Collins Jr., Noel, Brissett, all terrific. And then my final 2, I have Sinkfield and Gittins Jr. I think that being Canadian is going to put him over the top. And I think they carry 8. I think there's too much depth in that wide receiver room to not carry as many as they can.
Yeah, I think I kind of like your receivers better than mine now that I look at this. I feel like I've made a mistake I think I've got to I'm not going to go back because I think that's just one of those things you leave out there. But I feel like that's an area that I've missed on here in cutting either Chandler Worthy or Charles Sinkfield, because I think one of those guys needs to be on it, because otherwise my receivers are the same as yours. And you're right, like Gittins Jr., you can't cut him. He's had an amazing camp. He looks so good. I love him at that Z spot, actually. And that was somewhere that I expected. I thought Brissett would probably start in that spot, but Gittins Jr. has just been better. And so both of those guys look great out there, but I think that's probably Gittins Jr.'s job now. And we may be in a position where we've got 3 starting Canadian receivers all to the field side, which I certainly wasn't thinking a month ago. But that's how my depth chart is shaping up. But yeah, no, I'm already mad at the fact that I didn't keep 8 receivers. All right, well, let's see if I can burn you somewhere else on this field. How do we do for offensive line? I imagine we're pretty similar here because most of these guys, I think, are locks.
Yeah, I mean, I loaded up like as you did. Offensive line is the Canadian vault. So I have 7 Canadian offensive linemen and pool.
Wow. You kept 8 offensive linemen as well?
Yeah.
I feel like your roster is illegal. I'm going to have to take a close look at this because I only have 7 offensive linemen here. I've got 6. Yeah, I've got 6 Canadians, 1 American. So I'm looking to take advantage of your defense. I'm hoping my defense feels a lot better than yours because, yeah, right now I like your offense a little better than mine. So I wonder who else you have. So the Canadians, I think we probably have. Do you have 1 American?
My offensive line?
Yeah.
Just pool.
Yeah, that's the only American I have too. So I wonder who the extra Canadian is. So Nicastro, Blake, Bladek, Campbell. You've got those guys for sure. Shane Richards, Theron Churchill.
Yeah.
And who's your extra Canadian?
Smith.
Quinn Smith.
I mean, I could see potentially a debate between him and a Chempong on the D line. That'll be the question. I think offensive line is way more in flux, and so that's why I have the extra guy there rather than the defensive line, because I think offensive line they're gonna need bodies because they're really struggling from an injury perspective there.
I really like that move. Also, I hate that your roster is better than mine right now. I like that. I don't have the guts to keep Smith because there's just so many others. Because I wouldn't have even kept him. Even if I had 8, I wouldn't have kept Smith. But what I like about the flexibility that he offers is that he plays defensive line also. So he's a guy that plays both sides of the ball, and he can play center if need be. He was taking some center snaps. So, yeah, and he's a Canadian. All right. I'm going to give you that one too. So you have 8 offensive linemen, 7 Canadians. It's pretty amazing it just goes to show like how much Canadian talent there is. To have 7 Canadian offensive linemen on a roster is pretty amazing. You really could go off the board. It's a shame we've got so many guys that are right tackle specific. If you had one of like Theron Churchill, Shane Richards, or Jamal Campbell who could play left tackle, this would be, just to march out an entirely Canadian offensive line is awesome. All right, let's go to the defensive side of the ball. So defensive line, I've got 8. This is a place where I loaded up a little bit. I splurged a bit on defensive line. I feel like that's probably too many, but I had such a tough time. And even with 8, like I wanted 9, 10, 11. We've talked about that in past episodes. It's just such a talented positional group. How many did you go with for D-line?
Same, 8. I mean, I could easily have been 10, but that would be ridiculous. I think 8's the number, but yeah, there were some tough cuts in that 8, and again, like I say, like a Chempong on and off depending on whether I keep Smith, but I went with him off.
Yeah, I don't have a Chempong here. I think he probably starts the year on the practice roster. The only Canadian I have is Robbie Smith. And my starters, I'm basically looking at Charleston Hughes, Drake Nevis, Ronald Ollie, I think is going to start, which I think might surprise some people, but I think he's looked amazing in camp. I've been really impressed with him, as I have with a lot of these defensive linemen. I think Cordero Law is also going to start. And then that leaves me with 4 reserves on the line in Shane Ray, Sean Oakman, Eli Harold, and Robbie Smith. So that's how my D-line shapes out. Do you have the same 8 as me?
Yeah, I do, in fact. I think we both agreed that you keep Eli Harold. I think there's no way you let him go because he would be snapped up immediately from a defensive line point of view. I think he has the potential to be a star. So I really hope they keep him.
He's so fast. You should see him on the field. He looks like a linebacker. Like if it weren't for his height, you would mistake him for a backer. But he's such a big guy too. But he's so quick. That first step, both he and Ray. If you got those guys in the same package, just flying around, lined up in like a wide 9 or something like that, and just blistering around the edges, it's going to give people nightmares. Moving on to linebacker, I think this is an area where I've got you beat. I feel very good about my linebacker room because this is how my team is going to beat yours, is through special teams, and I've got a ton of great special teams players in my linebacking core. So we're just talking about the Mac and the Will spot here. I've got 6 guys out here. What are you going to do with that, JB?
Well, I mean that I had to pay the piper somewhere. I just have 5 linebackers, but I think that they are going to be a problem.
Yeah, we've got, I'm assuming, Mwamba, Cameron Judge as our 2 starters. I've got Jack Cassar and Dexter McCoyle backing up in both spots. McCoyle's an interesting one because he's the X factor that has allowed me to carry one less defensive back than I was going to, because if need be, if there's an injury somewhere in the defensive backfield, McCoyle can transition there. I feel fully comfortable playing him at either halfback spot, even at safety if need be. He can play that Sam backer spot. So if you've got an injury to Shaq or Richards or Edwards, then he's the immediate answer in those spots. So he's basically backing up like 6 different positions here. I think he's going to be on the field a lot. I think there's going to be a lot of packages where he's on the field. But yeah, I don't have him as a starter technically. But he's sort of that guy that allowed me to address fewer DBs, which we'll get to in just a moment. Other guys that I have Mezzalira, who I really believe is going to be on the team. And he's a special teams monster. He was such a steal. There's Hoagie wrote a great piece about him the other day. He's got a family who are diehard Hamilton Tiger Cats, and he was talking to Mezzalira the other day about it. And they're coming to terms with it, and they're going to start purchasing their Argo gear and stuff like that too. But it's just such a funny story because you can only imagine that Tie Cat obsessed family, and suddenly their boy is playing for the Toronto Argonauts. But yeah, he's such a great special teams player. So I think there's a spot waiting for him. I've got him listed as my 3rd string Mac, but kind of like with Asnell Robo, he has to have a position somewhere, but he's really here for his special teams. So we could have put him anywhere. I've got him listed as a linebacker, but I don't really expect him to play there. So Mwamba, Judge, Cassar, McCoyle, Mezzalira, and Trevor Hoyt is my last one. Canadian draft pick. He's looked really good in camp. I love what he brings, and he brings some real awesome special teams play like Cassar. He's been long snapping. Both he and Cassar actually long snap pretty much every day after practice. And so he's just got all sorts of added value. He's also a lot bigger than I realized. Seeing him in person, he just didn't look like that on film. Maybe it's because he was always standing next to Cassar, but somehow he just looks like a much bigger guy and way more CFL ready than I thought. So who are you missing? Which 5 guys do you have?
Mezzalira. I mean, I think that was the hardest cut. He probably does get on the squad somewhere. I couldn't figure out how to do it. I think Hoyt gets the nod over him. I think that they would have now the dream of sort of Hoyt being a partner with Cassar moving forward. I think that his ceiling is higher. So I would guess that they would keep him, but here I'm envious of you. I love him on the squad. They probably will figure out a way to do it. I just couldn't do it. But that's why they get paid the big bucks.
For defensive backs, I'm a little light here, but I'm very happy with how I've gone. So we're including the Sam backer spot into this. So for defensive backs, I've ended up going with 7 guys. How did you stack up for DBs, JB?
I went 8.
So I'm imagining, actually, I don't know where your extra guy might be. So let me go through mine and you tell me who you've got that I don't. Oh, I know who you've got. I know who you've got because you've still got your global player to cover here. So that's where you're going. So I've got Robertson Daniel at boundary corner, Shaq Richardson boundary half, Cresden Butler at safety. Jeff Richards is my field half. I've got Chris Edwards at Sam, and then my 2 Canadians, Arjun Calhoun and Matt Boateng at field corner. And so I'm guessing you've got Tiggy Sanko somewhere in there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that those are all the DBs I have. I actually pondered Busby, but had cut him before I saw that they cut him.
Yeah, and we'll go through those cuts in just a moment because there were cuts made today.
I think Sanko is built like a special teamer. I think that he He has the size and the speed. I think he's a better special teamer prospect than Robo, and that's why I went with him, because I think that I don't expect him ever to play the field as a defensive back, but I think that you could turn him into a real special team weapon, and I gave him the slight nod over Robo on that.
I think that's a fine call. I don't have a problem with that. He actually has looked better than I thought too. I don't think he's quite ready yet, but he's not that far off. He really actually looks quite comfortable out there. And I've seen him play in that field half spot. I've seen him play at the Sam spot, and I actually like him as a field half. But I think that's sort of where his future is going to be. But if he's on this team, I think he'll end up being behind Jeff Richards at field half. But he looks good. He's not nearly as far off. Remember, this is a guy that spent 2 entire seasons with the Cleveland Browns, working through their practice squad, and so he's been exposed to some really good quality football. So he's not nearly as far off, I think, as a lot of people think. So I have no problem with you keeping Sanko instead of Robo. I like Robo, but I don't think you can lose with either one of those guys. But I don't see a situation in which both are kept. Let's move on to the last, and I think mathematically, I think we're both left with 2 here, so this will not be the most exciting position to finish with. But for special teams, long snapper, since he's the only official long snapper listed on the depth chart, I'm assuming you went with Jake Reinhardt?
I did.
And Boris Bede as your punter kicker, or did you pull a surprise here?
No, I mean, I did ponder this position a little bit. But I don't think so. I think that BD is the clear winner in the kicking competition. Maybe they make him the reserve. But I like your idea of Pipkin as the reserve too, actually, when you said that. I think maybe it's more likely that Pipkin is the reserve moving forward. I would bet Coach would want a third quarterback, on the sideline rather than not playing at all. But I think BD Reinhardt here is a lock.
Yeah, it's interesting because before camp started, I had actually picked Sato as my upset pick over BD because I really like Sato. He looks good. And he hasn't disappointed in the least. And that just tells you how good Boris Bede has been. He is sensational. And I wrote about this in an article last week for xsandargos.com. I'm not a special teams guy. I don't get very excited about special teams. I know how important it is. I do understand that. Having coached for as long as I have, I've lost enough and won enough games on special teams. I get how big a deal it is, especially in Canada. But I don't, it doesn't really do anything for me. That said, I have watched Boris Bede more than any other single player every time I've been to camp. He has blown me away. The hang time he gets on his punts, the crazy range of his field goals is just something like I've never seen before. And so he absolutely embarrassed my pick of Toshiki Sato over him, just watching him in camp. But yeah, it's nothing Sato did. Sato looks great. He's a really good kicker, and so we got to make sure we don't lose him. I would have Sato in as my reserve. I think you're more likely to lose one kicker than you are to lose 2 quarterbacks. So that's just how I'm going to play that. So I'll have Sato as my reserve on game day and Bede as my punter kicker. And I'm so excited to see what he can do. And he's one of those players that isn't at all fazed by suddenly being in a game situation. You watch the difference between some kickers and punters. They're practicing on their own. They're kicking field goals from X distance and punting the ball beautifully. And then suddenly the whole team comes together and now there's a rush and we're going to see how you look. And they change a lot. With Boris Bede, you couldn't tell the difference. The kick that he makes with nobody in front of him is the same as the kick he makes when there are 12 people trying to block that ball. And with punts, with coffin corners, it's all the same. I feel so weird about it because it just doesn't feel like my role here. But yeah, he's been one of my favorite players in camp. Today, the Toronto Argonauts released a number of players in advance of final cutdown day. 4 defensive backs were let go in Shamar Busby, Kadeem Satchel, Andrew Soro, and Devontae Merriweather. 3 receivers were released, Jalen Smith, Craig Rucker, and Naquan Murray. And 2 running backs were let go, Kenneth Dixon and Greg McCrae. I wasn't shocked at any of these releases Although I did think that Greg McCrae was going to find himself a practice roster spot, and it doesn't look like it at this point with this being such an early release. I guess it's not that early. We're only a few days away. But he's gotten a lot of time, a lot of looks in camp. I think probably with DJ Foster coming in, that was sort of the beginning of the end for Greg McCrae. But he's a player that I like. He impressed me. I thought he had some nice energy, some really nice quickness to the outside. So that was a little bit surprising. I wouldn't be surprised to see some of these guys catch on with other teams. And there may be a lot of movement over the next few days as teams start to release these huge chunks of players and pare down their final rosters. Well, that will just about do it for us today on the X's and Argos podcast. It is time, folks. If you have not yet done so, find a friend of yours who loves the Toronto Argonauts and tell them about our podcast. We're a week and a half away from the start of the regular season. I can't wait. For JB, my name's Ben Grant, saying so long, and may all your pre-snap reads be good ones. I'll see ya.
Go, Toronto Argos, go, go, go. Pull together, fight the foe.